This week's video is on Chapter 4, Activity-Based Costing, Lean Operations, and Costs of Quality. Our learning objectives are 4.1, develop and use departmental overhead rates to allocate indirect costs. 4.2, develop and use activity-based costing, ABC, to allocate indirect costs. 4.3, understand the benefits and limitations of ABC and ABM systems. 4.4, describe lean operations. 4.5, describe and use the costs of quality framework. Okay, learning objective number 1, develop and use departmental overhead rates to allocate indirect costs. So we've already learned how to allocate manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overhead, also known as indirect costs. We've already gone through the process of allocating that. And the question might be is why and how do companies refine their cost allocation systems? Well, why would they refine? Well, the answer to that question is simply maybe the allocation that we've come up with so far is not good enough. It's not accurate enough. So as a result of that, there can be some significant cost distortions. So if you're in that situation, you might decide, I need a little bit more sophisticated allocation system. We've already learned plant-wide allocation system. We learned that in the previous chapter. But maybe that's just not quite good enough. Maybe we need to be a little bit more sophisticated. Who can refine the benefit from it? Manufacturing companies, service companies, and governmental agencies. Okay, the plant-wide overhead rate, a predetermined MOH rate applied to every job produced in the plant. Well, that sounds familiar because that's exactly what we learned. We'll compute a predetermined MOH rate, and to do that, we'll take estimated MOH and divide it by the total estimated allocation base. This is nothing new. We've actually learned this. We learned it in our previous chapter. By the time we finished that chapter, we were all pretty convinced that we got this nailed. It's done. We don't need to get any more sophisticated. Well, maybe that's not the case. So here's an example of the plant-wide overhead rate. Estimated MOH for 1 year is $1 million. The estimated allocation base is 62,500 direct labor hours. So in this example, we've decided that direct labor hours is the cost driver. It is the allocation base we're going to use to allocate indirect costs to jobs or even whatever the objective is. And we're going to come up with a predetermined MOH rate. Well, we're going to take $1 million, and we're going to divide that by 62,500 direct labor hours. So the answer is it's $16 per direct labor hour. So now we're going to look at specific jobs. And in this example here, we're saying that job 101, which was 1 elliptical, ended up incurring 10 direct labor hours. Well, we've already determined what the dollar per hour is. It's $16. So we'll take $16, multiply it by the 10 direct labor hours, and that will result in $160 allocated to that specific job. Now we'll go to job 102, and that was 1 treadmill. And that also took 10 direct labor hours. Well, it took 10 direct labor hours. We're using that as the base, the allocation base. So then we just take that 10 and multiply it by $16 per direct labor hour, and we come up with $160. Okay, if we're using a plant-wide overhead rate, this is what occurs. MOH to the specific job, 160 goes to 101, and 160 goes to job 102. Now we may decide that, well, maybe that's an oversimplification. maybe we need to be a little bit better at figuring out how much overhead really needs to be allocated to specific jobs. Okay, so let's take a look at the departmental overhead rates. The first question we need to be asking ourselves is, do the different departments have different amounts and types of MOH costs? Well, in this example here, the plant-wide is 1 million, but look, you have 400,000 towards the machining and 600,000 to assembly. So, I mean, if it were even 5 to 5, you might decide, well, that's not significantly different. This is not like extraordinarily different, but still it's different, and you might decide that because of that difference, it's relevant. The next question you're going to be asking yourself is, do different products use the departments to a different extent? Yeah, because the elliptical uses machining for 1 direct labor hour and 9 direct labor hours for assembly. See, we were just kind of assuming 10 across the board, that it was kind of evenly distributed, but for sure the elliptical, the treadmill is closer, it's at 4 and 6, but all you would need is 1 distortion for 1 product, and that may make a big difference amongst all the products. Okay, so departmental overhead rates, you're establishing separate manufacturing overhead rates for each department. See, the plant-wide was just one rate, but now for departmental overhead rates, we're going to establish a different rate for every department. Life Fitness will establish one for machining department and the other for the assembly department. Okay, so this process that we're talking about for establishing departmental overhead rates is really the same process that we learned for the plant-wide. The difference is that now, instead of 1 for the plant-wide, we're going to figure out the overhead rate allocations for every department. So step 1, let's estimate the total MOH costs incurred in each department in the upcoming year. Step 2, select an allocation base for each department and estimate the total amount that will be used during the year. We could continue to use 1 allocation base, but we may decide that, you know what, it's actually going to be more accurate to use different allocation bases. So we'd have to study that to see if that would make a difference. Number 3, calculate the departmental overhead rates. And then this is the same computation that we've learned before. We'll take total estimated, but the difference is now this is department overhead cost pool. This is the department rather than the overall overhead costs. And then we're going to divide that by the total estimated amount of the specific department allocation base. So we're doing the same thing we've done before, except now we're breaking it down by department. And then from there, we're going to allocate some MOH from each department to the individual jobs that use those departments. We'll take the departmental overhead rate multiplied by the actual amount of the departmental allocation base used by the job. Same thing again that we learned from a plant-wide perspective, except we're going to do it twice instead of once. Before it was plant-wide, it was just 1 plant. Here we're having 2 departments. We'll do it twice. If you have 5 departments, guess what? Got to do it 5 times. Okay, so step 1, we're going to come up with our total department overhead costs, and they refer to them as cost pools. I guess conceptually, we're going to have a different pool for every department, and those are going to be costs are going to be put in this pool. I mean, I don't know if you want to think of it as a swimming pool or whatever it may be, but pool, we're just putting everything together in different areas, okay? So machining department has 400,000. We've already learned that. We saw that in the previous slide. And assembly department has 600,000. The total is 1 million, which we learned or we used in the plant-wide MOH, but we're breaking it down between the 2. Step 2, let's come up with an allocation base. Now, apparently we're going to use direct labor hours again for both the machining and the assembly, but now we're going to estimate what their specific direct labor hours are going to be for each department. In the example when we used the plant-wide, we used total direct labor hours. In fact, let's go check. What was the total direct labor hours? 62,500. That's what we use for the plant-wide. So because this is just breaking it down in more detail, yeah, this is the same. In total, it's the same, 62,500, but we're breaking it down into more detail. Of that 62,500, 12,500 is for machining, and assembly is 50,000. So we're just breaking things down in more detail. So now we'll go in computing the overhead rates for each department. We have 2 departments, so we're going to compute them for each department. How are we going to do this? Well, the total overhead costs, 400,000 and 600,000, that machining and assembly. 400,000 for machining, 600,000 for assembly. Let's just focus on machining right now. So 400,000. We're going to divide that by the machining allocation base of estimated was 12,500 direct labor hours. And machining is now going to earn $32 of overhead per direct labor hour. For assembly, 600,000 divided by 50,000 direct labor hours comes up with $12. $12 per direct labor hour. And then finally, number 4, we're going to go ahead and allocate based upon the actual hours. So machining, $32 per hour, that was the rate. We multiply it by 1 direct labor hour. For machining, it was 1 direct labor hour. And that ended up for job 101, the elliptical ended up getting 32 times 1, which is $32. So for the MOH for job 1 ends up getting, the MOH allocated to job 101 is $32 for machining. Now, assembly, we figured out that $12 per direct labor hour. We figured out that that takes 9 direct labor hours, and therefore 12 times 9 is 108. So the total MOH allocated to job 101 was $140. Now job 102, that was the elliptical. We went and traced that. We're still using the same rates, but we have different hours. We have 4 direct labor hours for machining on that one. That's $128. 32 times 4, 128. Assembly is getting 12 times 6, 72. So we add this up. So job number 102 gets $200 of MOH. So if we want to look at this from a conceptual perspective, we're going to take the total plant-wide MOH of 1 million, break it down between departments. Each one is going to have its own allocation rate, and then we're going to allocate it specifically by job to, each department is going to be allocated to the job. And this is 101, job 102, and there's going to be other jobs, which we're only talking about 2 jobs right here. We're tracking for 2. So now let's go ahead and compare the results. Compare the plant-wide overhead allocation to the departmental overhead allocation. When we use the plant-wide overhead rate allocation, we ended up coming to $160 for job 101 and $160 for job 102. That is shown in the previous slide, or exhibit 4-2. When we computed the departmental overhead rate MOH allocation, which is exhibits 4-8 and 4-9, we came up with $140 for job 101 and $200 for job 102. So we'll look at these differences and see, are they significant? Well, the difference between plant-wide overhead and the department overhead allocation rate for job 101, we ended up, if we would have stuck with the plant-wide overhead rate, we would have overstated costs by $20. So 160 was with the plant-wide, and it was only 140. So we would have missed it by what? By $20. If we look at job 102, we would have allocated 160, and in fact, we should have allocated 200 in a more sophisticated way. So now we're undercosted by $40. Now, is that significant? Well, it kind of depends on what you're selling your product for. If you're talking about an elliptical that normally costs maybe $5,000, I don't know if $20 is going to be that big of a difference. But let's say your elliptical, you sell them for like $300 or $400. You're getting close. If you're getting closer to $100 to $200, then this is going to be significant, particularly, and the 40 for sure. $100, $200 for sure is way over costed or under costed in this case. So those differences could make a significant difference. Remember what I told you earlier, that cost accounting helps us with pricing. Well, if we're figuring the wrong cost, we may end up charging the wrong price.